I booked a cozy guest house in Santa Barbara for a week. It was tucked behind a bigger house with its own little yard and a narrow concrete path that ran along the side. The guest house was small, just one room with a bed, a kitchenette, and a bathroom, but it looked peaceful, quiet. The sliding glass door at the front faced the little backyard and had thin white curtains that didn't fully reach the floor. I liked how sunlight came in during the morning. It felt private enough, and I figured Santa Barbara was safe. That's what everyone always says. The host wasn't around when I got there. She'd left the key in a lockbox and messaged me with instructions. Everything seemed fine. The place was clean, smelled a bit like old wood, and the bed was surprisingly comfortable. I unpacked my stuff, set up my laptop on the small table near the door, and settled in. I'd brought a little Ring camera with me, one of those battery-operated ones you can place anywhere. I travel alone a lot, and I've had bad experiences before, so I always bring it. I set it on the inside window ledge near the sliding door. It faced outward, covering the yard and the narrow walkway leading up to the main house. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I worked on my laptop during the day and explored town in the evenings. I walked along the beach, ate tacos by the pier, and even caught a sunset. The neighborhood was quiet. All I ever heard were some dogs barking in the distance and the occasional wind rustling the trees. I liked how still it was at night. It helped me sleep. But on the 3rd night, I came back from dinner and noticed the sliding door wasn't fully shut. It was open maybe 2 inches. I stopped in my tracks and just stared at it. I was sure, absolutely sure, I'd locked it before I left. I always double-check doors. I've done that for years. At first I thought maybe I'd somehow forgotten this one time. I walked over and slid it shut, then locked it tight. But when I looked down, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. On the mat just inside the door, there were dirt marks. Not shoe prints, bare feet. You could see the toes, the arches, even the heel outline. Like someone had stepped inside, paused, and turned back. I stood there staring for what felt like minutes. I didn't want to touch anything. My heart was pounding, and I kept looking around the room to see if anything was missing, or worse, if someone was still there. But the place was empty. Nothing looked moved. My bag was still zipped up where I left it. I opened the closet, checked the bathroom, even crouched down to look under the bed. Nothing. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the Ring app. I hadn't checked it since I arrived. I honestly just set it up out of habit, but I thought maybe it had caught something. I scrubbed through the feed for the last few hours, watching the yard in fast motion as the sky darkened. Then I hit pause at 2:42 a.m. that morning. A man was walking past the glass door. He moved slowly, almost dragging one foot behind the other. He wasn't wearing shoes. His arms hung loosely at his sides, and his head was tilted toward the door. Toward me, if I'd been awake at that time. He didn't knock. He didn't try the handle. He just stood there, staring in. For almost 5 minutes. He didn't shift his weight, didn't look around, just stood and stared. Then he turned and walked back the way he came, disappearing into the shadows along the path that led toward the main house. That was it. No sound, no second appearance, nothing else on the footage. I must have been asleep while he was standing there, just a few feet from me. I stayed frozen for a while, just sitting on the bed with the video paused. I replayed it twice to make sure I wasn't seeing it wrong. But it was real. He was there. And now the door had been open when I got back. He'd been inside. I didn't sleep that night. I pushed the small table in front of the door and jammed one of the chairs against it. I didn't care how flimsy the setup was. It made me feel like I had a barrier. I kept all the lights on. Every time I heard a creak or a gust of wind outside, I'd sit up and stare at the curtains, waiting for movement. I watched the Ring feed like it was a movie. Nothing else happened that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the room while I was out, maybe even watched me while I slept the night before. The next morning, I walked around the yard looking for more footprints. There were faint marks in the dirt along the path, like bare feet had moved through, but they were smudged. No clear direction, just enough to confirm someone had been walking around back there. I looked up at the main house. The windows were closed, the blinds drawn. I didn't know if the host lived there or rented it out too. but I didn't care anymore. I packed up my stuff and left. I didn't tell the host what happened. I didn't leave a review. I just got in my car and drove to a hotel in town. A chain hotel. One with a lobby, staff, cameras, and thick doors with deadbolts. I paid extra for it and I didn't care. For days after, I kept checking the ring footage, hoping I wouldn't see that man again. Hoping it was just a one-time thing. But I also kept wondering, how did he get in? The lock on the sliding door was one of those simple latch locks. Not great, but it should have held. Maybe it didn't fully click shut. Maybe he pried it. Or maybe he had been watching the place, waiting for a chance. I still think about it. I think about how long he stood there, just watching. About the way he didn't knock or speak or move. Like he was studying me, or waiting for something. I don't know if he lived nearby, or if he'd followed me from town, or if he knew the layout of the property already. I don't know if he'd been inside the night before, while I slept with the door just a few feet away from my head. But I do know this, if I hadn't set up that camera, I never would have known he was there. And I might have stayed longer, never realizing someone was creeping around outside every night, just waiting for the right moment. I booked the Airbnb late at night on my phone, half asleep on the couch. I was flying into New York for a short trip, just a couple days, and didn't want to spend a fortune. The place was listed as a cozy studio in Brooklyn. Clean, quiet, private. The photos showed a simple room with a bed, a little kitchenette, and what looked like natural light coming from somewhere off-frame. The host had decent reviews. Not tons, but enough to make it seem legit. The price was way lower than others in the area, but I figured maybe I got lucky. People cancel last minute, prices drop. I wasn't thinking much of it. When I got there, I had to buzz into an unmarked building that looked more like a storage unit than an apartment complex. No sign, no name, just a plain metal door and a keypad. The host had messaged me the code earlier, along with instructions. Go to Unit 3C. Door will be unlocked. I stepped inside, and the hallway was dim. One overhead bulb flickered as I passed. It didn't feel like an apartment building. No carpet, no decorations, just cold concrete floors and silent doors with peeling numbers. When I reached 3C, I tried the handle. It opened easily. The studio was smaller than I expected. Much smaller. Just a mattress on a wooden frame, a nightstand with a dusty lamp, and a kitchenette with a mini fridge and microwave. The bathroom was tucked behind a sliding door that didn't fully close. The walls were painted beige, but it was patchy, like someone had started repainting and given up halfway through. The ceiling was low. The whole place smelled faintly of plastic and something else I couldn't name. Old air, maybe. It was completely silent. I dropped my bag and turned to look for the window. There wasn't one. I looked again, checked the bathroom too. Not a single window. No natural light, no airflow, nothing. The place felt wrong in a way I couldn't put into words. The air inside was dead still, like the air in a box that's been taped shut for weeks. The kind of stillness that starts making you anxious after a few minutes, even if you don't know why. I walked back to the door and examined the lock. That's when I saw it. The lock was on the outside. Not just the latch, an actual keyed deadbolt. No interior knob, no way to lock or unlock it from inside. Just a smooth metal plate on my side. That didn't make sense. I tried the handle again. Turned, but the door didn't budge. Jammed. I pushed harder, tried pulling. Nothing. I crouched down, looked closer at the frame. There was a slight gap, but the door was solid. No chain, no second lock. Just stuck. I stepped back and shoved it with my shoulder, thinking maybe it was swollen from humidity or something, but it held firm. It didn't even rattle. That's when I started getting nervous. I pulled out my phone and called the host. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. I sent a text. Hey, I think the door's stuck. Can't open it from the inside. Please call me. No reply. I waited a few minutes, pacing. The air was getting worse. It was warm, unmoving. I turned the lamp off, then back on again, just to see if the power was working. It was. I tried the microwave. It lit up. Everything worked except the door. I started banging. At first, just knocking loud enough for someone in the hallway to maybe hear. Then harder. I yelled. Nothing. The building felt empty. After about 30 minutes of this, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow, soft, like sneakers on concrete. They approached from down the hallway, got closer, then stopped just outside my door. I held my breath. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't say anything, just stood there. I could hear them breathing, not loud, but enough. Close. I stepped back from the door, heart pounding. The air in the room felt even heavier now, like I was breathing in someone else's exhale. Then, just as slowly, the footsteps started again. They walked away, faint, then gone. I didn't move for a while. Eventually, I grabbed the fork from the kitchen drawer and started jamming it into the edge of the door. I didn't have tools, just that. I worked it into the tiny gap, trying to push against the latch or wedge the bolt free. It wasn't easy. I had to bend the fork, snap one of the prongs off. I kept working. My fingers got cut. My arm ached from the angle. But eventually, after hours, I felt the bolt shift, just a little. I twisted the fork and pushed hard. There was a loud pop as the door gave an inch. I threw my shoulder into it and the whole thing burst open. The hallway was empty, silent, lights still flickering. No one in sight. I didn't wait. I didn't even stop to close the door. I ran down the stairs and out into the street. The second the air hit my face, I realized how long I'd gone without fresh air. Felt like I'd been buried. I walked fast, almost jogging, until I found a main road. Then I called a lift and got the hell out of there. I didn't sleep that night. I booked a hotel near the airport and stayed up, trying to make sense of it. I kept checking the Airbnb listing. It was still up. Same photos, same description. I reported it, left a review, contacted customer service. They removed the listing a few days later, but the host account stayed active under a different name. I screenshotted everything. There was no explanation, no apology, no follow-up. I think about it sometimes. What would have happened if I hadn't gotten that fork to work? If I hadn't noticed the lock? If I had fallen asleep in that room? I still don't know if it was some kind of trap or just a neglected room in a building nobody checked anymore. But someone stood outside that door, listening, breathing, and they didn't try to help. They didn't even knock. The apartment was in a quiet residential area, tucked behind a row of small cafes and shops just outside the city. I booked it because the host had perfect ratings, 5 stars across dozens of reviews. People said things like immaculate space, attentive host, and felt like home. The photos were simple but showed a clean, well-furnished place. A beige couch, a small dining table, large windows letting in soft light, and a bedroom with a queen bed. Nothing flashy, just calm and warm. The host's profile seemed normal. Smiling picture, verified status, long-winded replies to reviewers thanking them. Felt solid. When I arrived, everything matched the pictures. The code worked. The unit was spotless. I checked every room out of habit. No strange smells, no odd noises. There were clean towels in the bathroom, a fresh roll of toilet paper, and even a handwritten welcome note on the counter. I remember thinking how rare that kind of effort had become. There was even a little box of tea bags and instant coffee by the microwave. It felt like someone actually cared about the stay. I unpacked slowly, hanging my shirts in the closet, plugging in my chargers, putting my shoes by the door. I planned to be there for 5 nights while I handled some contract work nearby. The first 2 days went smoothly. I worked during the day and came back to cook dinner or watch something on my laptop. There was a small desk in the corner of the living room, and the Wi-Fi was fast enough for video calls. The neighbors seemed quiet. I didn't hear much except the occasional footsteps above or a dog barking down the street. I felt safe. But on the 3rd night, I got a message. Came through Airbnb from a profile I didn't recognize. The name was different, something generic like Property Manager 21. It said, "Hi, this is the real owner of the apartment you're staying in." That listing was made using stolen photos from my original posting. Please vacate the premises immediately. This is not a joke. I stared at the message for a full minute, trying to figure out if it was spam. The tone was too aggressive to be from Airbnb themselves. I checked the message thread again. It wasn't from the original host, who had been polite and responsive when I asked for a restaurant recommendation the day I arrived. This was a different profile altogether. I responded with something short, something like, "What are you talking about?" But they didn't answer right away. A few minutes later, they messaged again. "This place was listed without my permission. I've reported it. You need to leave." Felt strange. Not just the message, but the timing. Everything had been fine until that point. But now my brain was running in circles. Was it a scam? Some weird phishing trick? But it was on Airbnb's platform, right inside the messaging system. That part threw me off. I went to the original host's profile and compared it with the new one. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The profile photo on both was basically the same person, but slightly different. Same face, same haircut, even the same clothes. But the newer profile had a different name and a slightly different smile. Almost like it was taken seconds apart. I clicked about this host on both profiles. The bios were nearly identical. Not just similar, they were structured the same way. "Hi, I've lived in this area for 10 plus years, love meeting travelers." And then some personal detail about liking to cook or enjoying local history. But one had better grammar. The other read like it had been rewritten quickly, like a rushed copy. Then I noticed the kicker. Both profiles used the same phone number in their contact info, word for word. I checked 3 times just to be sure I wasn't mixing them up. Same number, different names, different profile photos, both verified, both with listings for the same unit. I sat back and stared at the wall for a bit. Something was off. I didn't know who I had actually booked with anymore. I didn't even know if either of them was real. The apartment had all the signs of being legitimately rented: keypad lock, utilities, Wi-Fi, cleaning supplies. But now it just felt like I was squatting in someone else's place without knowing it. I messaged Airbnb, marked the message as urgent, explained everything, attached screenshots. No reply right away. I waited about an hour, then tried calling their support line, but it kept looping through menus before hanging up. I was starting to feel exposed. I kept looking at the door like someone might walk in at any minute. I sat on the edge of the couch and started packing my bag without even deciding to. My laptop, my chargers, my clothes. I shoved everything into the duffel and zipped it shut. I kept imagining a key turning in the door, someone stepping inside with some legal claim or anger or worse. I couldn't trust the place anymore. I looked around before I left. Everything was still clean. Nothing had moved. No sign that anything had changed. But the feeling was different now. I no longer trusted the apartment or the host or even the platform. I drove to a mid-range hotel 20 minutes away. It was bland but solid. Late-night desk clerk, fluorescent lighting, a lock that made a solid noise when it latched. I stayed there for the rest of my trip. Airbnb finally responded 2 days later, after I'd already checked out. Their message was polite, vague. "Thanks for bringing this to our attention. We take matters like these seriously. The listing in question has been removed pending investigation." That was it. No apology, no explanation. Out of curiosity, I checked both host profiles again. Gone. Both of them. Removed like they never existed. I even searched the apartment's address through Airbnb's map search, and it didn't show up anymore. I guess they scrubbed the whole thing. But that just left more questions. I never figured out who actually owned the place. Maybe the original listing had been stolen. Maybe someone had made a duplicate to steal bookings. Or maybe both were fake. Some elaborate setup to squeeze money out of short-term rentals before getting caught. But what scared me most was how normal everything had seemed. The clean rooms, the working keypad, the good reviews. None of it meant anything in the end. I still use Airbnb sometimes, but now I check everything twice. I reverse search photos. I scan reviews with a different eye. I only book from superhosts now, and even then, I double-check that their listings don't overlap with someone else's. That apartment looked like a normal place. felt safe. It was quiet, but it was a lie, and I still don't know who I was actually renting from. I booked a condo for 3 nights in a quiet part of San Diego, not far from the water. The photos looked great, clean, bright, modern, nothing fancy, but it had good reviews and was close to where I needed to be. I was in town for a quick break after a rough couple of months. I figured I'd spend the days walking around the marina, maybe check out some local food spots, and just catch up on rest. The listing said it was a peaceful escape for solo travelers, and it felt exactly like what I needed. When I arrived, everything seemed normal enough. The building was one of those newer, compact types with multiple short-term rentals stacked next to each other. I had to punch in a code to open the lobby door and again to get into the condo. The place was a studio, small but clean. Queen-sized bed, a little kitchen area, a balcony facing the alley. There wasn't much of a view, just a brick wall across from me, but I didn't care. It was quiet. The bathroom was toward the back, near the door. It was basic, white walls, beige tile, a single sink with a mirror above it. The mirror immediately caught my eye. It wasn't like the frameless kind you usually see in rentals. This one had a thick black border around it, uneven in texture, almost rubbery in spots. I assumed maybe the owner tried to frame the mirror themselves and just didn't do a great job. It didn't look professionally done. It stuck out about 1.5 inches from the wall, which was weird, but I didn't think too much about it that first night. I was tired. I showered, brushed my teeth, and went to bed early. The second day, I spent most of it outside. I walked around the waterfront, grabbed lunch from a little taco stand near the pier, and hung out by the beach until sunset. I got back to the condo around 8. I made a simple dinner, scrolled through my phone for a while, and then went to take a shower. That's when I really noticed the mirror again. I stood there brushing my teeth and found myself staring at it. The frame looked thicker than it should be. Not just thick, but deep, like a box around the mirror. The surface of the glass was clean, but there was something off about how it reflected. I can't explain it exactly. It just looked darker than usual, even though the bathroom light was on full brightness. I leaned in closer. The black border wasn't wood. Felt like plastic. When I tapped on the mirror, it made a dull, hollow sound. Not the sharp, hard sound glass usually makes. I knocked again, harder this time. Still hollow. I pressed my palm flat against it, then my ear. Nothing, but something about it made my stomach tighten. I told myself I was being paranoid. It's probably just mounted weird, but I couldn't let it go. I left the bathroom and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door. I pulled up my phone and searched two-way mirror Airbnb, just out of curiosity. I'd read stories before, creepy stuff, people discovering hidden cameras, or weird setups in rentals. Some sounded fake, some didn't. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining someone behind the mirror, watching. I knew it was probably nothing, but the thought wouldn't leave me. In the morning, I stood in front of the mirror again. I pushed on the bottom edge. It flexed slightly. It wasn't bolted in, it was held with some kind of adhesive strips, maybe Velcro. I told myself I'd just check, just once, and if it was nothing, I could stop obsessing. I pulled the mirror away from the wall. Came off easier than I expected. Behind it was a rough hole in the drywall. It wasn't cut cleanly, jagged edges, splintered drywall, no frame. Behind the hole was darkness. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and held it up. It was a small space behind the wall, maybe 2.5 feet deep, 4 feet tall. It looked like a shallow crawl space, just enough room for someone to crouch or sit. The floor of it was bare wood. Inside were a few items, a crumpled fast food wrapper, a small empty water bottle, and some used tissues. There was also a folded blanket shoved into the corner. It wasn't dusty. It looked like someone had been using it recently. And worst of all, behind where the mirror had been was a clean square of two-way glass. I stood there frozen for a minute. My brain just stopped. I kept telling myself this had to be some kind of mistake, but there was no way to explain it. Someone had been sitting in there behind the mirror watching. I don't know for how long, I don't know if it was during my shower or when I was asleep, but there was no dust on the floor, and the water bottle still had condensation on the inside. I packed up in less than 5 minutes. I didn't even fold my clothes, just shoved everything into my bag. I didn't look back at the bathroom. I just took the mirror and set it face down on the kitchen counter. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to just put it back like nothing happened. I took a video on my phone showing the hole, the crawl space, the stuff inside. I emailed it to myself just in case. I booked a room at a regular hotel downtown and left the condo without telling the host anything. Once I was checked in somewhere safe, I reported the listing to Airbnb. I sent the video and photos. I got a message from their trust and safety team within a few hours asking more questions. I sent everything. They told me they would investigate. A day later, the listing disappeared. I don't know what happened after that. Airbnb never followed up. I checked for a few days to see if the same condo showed up again under a different name, but it didn't. I don't know if the host was the one watching from behind that mirror, or if it was someone else who had access to the unit. Maybe a previous guest set it up. Maybe someone had been living in that wall, coming and going when no one was around. The condo had a digital lock, but those things aren't hard to bypass if someone knows the code, or if they're already inside. There were no cameras in the hallway, no front desk, nothing. I still don't know how long the setup had been there. I think about it sometimes, especially when I check into new places. I check the mirrors now. Every time. I knock. I push. I don't care how paranoid it looks, because someone had been back there, and I still don't know if they watched me sleep, or shower, or both. I rented a guest suite in a large house just outside Atlanta for a short stay. It was a last-minute booking, and most hotels in the city were already full because of some convention. The listing said the place was quiet, clean, and private, and the photos showed a spacious bedroom with a private bathroom, a little kitchenette, and its own entrance through the side of the house. The host lived in the main part of the house but promised complete privacy. There were a lot of positive reviews, most of them mentioning how respectful and hands-off the host was, so I didn't think twice. When I arrived, it was already dark outside. The house sat on a wooded street, not exactly isolated, but spaced out from the neighbors. The area felt safe enough. The host had left the key in a lockbox near the side door like they said they would. The entrance led directly into the guest suite. It looked just like the photos, simple and tidy. Beige carpet, pale gray walls, a queen-sized bed, a little writing desk, a small fridge and microwave tucked into a corner. There was a hallway leading to the bathroom, and just off the hallway there was another door. It was white like the others, but unlike the rest, it had a small printed sign taped to it that read, in all caps, "Do not open." That caught my eye right away. I tried the handle out of instinct, and it didn't turn. Locked. I assumed it connected to a storage space, or maybe to the rest of the house. Either way, it wasn't my business, and I was tired from the long drive, so I let it go. The first night passed without anything strange. I ate takeout on the bed, watched something dumb on my laptop, and fell asleep early. The suite was quiet. In fact, almost too quiet. I didn't hear anything from the rest of the house. No footsteps upstairs. No doors opening or closing. I figured the host must have been gone or maybe just kept to themselves, like the reviews said. The next night, I was reading in bed when I heard a faint noise. It sounded like tapping, almost rhythmic, coming from the direction of the locked door. First, I ignored it. Houses make noises, especially older ones, and the listing had said this house was built in the 70s. But after a few minutes, it became clear that it wasn't just random creaks or groans. The sound was steady. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again. A soft knock, then another, then silence, then another knock. It didn't sound like pipes. I've lived in old apartments before. Pipes rattle, they hiss, sometimes they bang when hot water flows through them. But this sounded different, slower, heavier, almost like someone knocking gently from the other side. I sat there, listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the longer I stayed still, the more unsettled I felt. I texted the host just to make myself feel better. I I didn't want to come off paranoid, so I worded it casually. I asked if the room behind the locked door had anything in it that might be making noise. The reply came about 10 minutes later. Asterisk, that's just the storage room. Sometimes the pipes knock when the pressure shifts. It's totally normal. Asterisk. I stared at the message for a long time. Something about the wording felt a little too prepared, too polished. Still, I didn't want to push it. I put on some white noise and went to sleep. The third night, I was uneasy from the moment it got dark. I kept glancing at the door. That little sign taped to it bothered me more than it should have. Do not open. It was typed in bold Arial font and printed on regular paper. No frame, no logo, just those words. Felt lazy, like someone slapped it on in a hurry. I noticed the door had small scratch marks near the bottom edge. Faint but real. I hadn't seen them before. I decided I wasn't going to wait around for another round of knocking. Before bed, I dragged one of the wooden chairs from the little desk and wedged it tight under the doorknob. It didn't fit perfectly, but it held. I pushed the trash bin and my suitcase up against it, too. Not because I thought someone would come through it, but because the idea that it might open was driving me crazy. I laid in bed staring at the ceiling for hours. My heart was racing even though nothing was happening. Eventually, I drifted off. Around 2 a.m., I woke up with a start. I didn't know why at first. There hadn't been a loud noise, just a sense of something wrong. I sat up, eyes still adjusting to the dark, and turned toward the door. The chair had been moved, not knocked over or tossed aside, just moved. It was about a foot away from the door now, tipped slightly, like someone had pushed it just enough to squeeze the door open. And the door was open. Not wide, just a crack, maybe 2 inches, but enough to see that the darkness behind it wasn't just a dark room. It was black, a deep, unnatural black that felt heavier than shadow. I couldn't see anything inside. No light, no walls, nothing. Just a cold, empty space behind that door. I didn't move. My legs felt frozen under the blanket. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. All I knew was that the chair I had wedged under the doorknob, asterisk firmly wedged asterisk, had been moved. The trash bin was still there. The suitcase, too. But the chair had been slid aside quietly, and the door had opened. I stayed frozen for at least a full minute, maybe more, just watching that crack, waiting for it to move more, waiting for a hand or a face or something to come through. But nothing did. That somehow made it worse. I didn't grab anything. I didn't even put on my shoes. I got out of bed, picked up my phone, and walked straight to the door that led outside. I didn't care how it looked. I unlocked it, stepped into the night, and didn't stop until I reached my car parked out on the street. My heart was pounding the whole time. I drove straight to a gas station and sat there in the parking lot until sunrise. Then I booked a hotel near the airport and stayed there until it was time to leave Atlanta. I never got an explanation. I didn't message the host again. I didn't ask what was behind that door or how it opened. I didn't want to know. A week later, I got a generic message from Airbnb asking if I wanted to leave a review. I didn't, but sometimes when it's quiet at night, I remember the way the chair was moved. Just enough to open the door, but not enough to make noise. I think about the black space behind it, how it didn't feel like a room, felt like something was waiting, and someone or something had opened that door from the other side. I booked the guest house because it was cheap, had decent photos, and the listing said it had just been vacated by long-term tenants. It looked simple, 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a clean bathroom. The reviews were sparse, but they were all positive. Mostly things like quiet stay and great for a weekend. I wasn't expecting anything fancy. I just needed a place to crash for a few nights while I dealt with some work stuff in town. When I arrived, the host wasn't there. They'd left the key under a potted plant near the door, just like they said. The place looked exactly like the photos, though a little more worn out in person. There were scuff marks on the walls, and the couch sagged more than it should have. Nothing too strange, though. I noticed a toothbrush behind the sink that night. It was an old blue one, frayed at the ends, like someone had been using it for months. It wasn't mine. I thought maybe the cleaners just missed it, but it was placed carefully behind the faucet, tucked like someone meant to keep it hidden but close enough to use. That was the first thing. The second thing I noticed was the smell coming from the bedroom. Not strong, but lived in. I've stayed in plenty of rentals, and you can always tell when a place hasn't been used in a while. This one didn't have that musty emptiness. It smelled like deodorant and sweat, like someone had just been in there not long ago. When I unpacked my bag, I found more signs. Behind the dresser were a couple of dirty socks, rolled up like someone had stuffed them there in a rush. I pulled the dresser out and saw a wadded-up t-shirt wedged behind it too. I held it up and looked at it for a second. It had stains on it, maybe coffee or food, and it smelled like body odor. It wasn't old. I opened the drawers, thinking maybe the place just hadn't been cleared out properly, but they were all empty, clean. The fridge was mostly bare, but there was a receipt stuck under a magnet. It was from a grocery store about 10 minutes away, dated 2 days before I arrived. I checked the items: milk, eggs, apples, a pack of frozen dumplings. The milk and eggs were gone, but the apples were still in the crisper. There were 4 of them, all fresh. No expiration date stickers. They looked new. That night, I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was staying in someone else's place. Not like a normal rental, more like I'd walked into someone's home while they were out. Everything felt too personal. The way the towels were folded, the slippers by the door. The light bulb in the bathroom was one of those warm orange ones, like someone had changed it for their own comfort, not a generic rental choice. The next morning, I went into the kitchen to make coffee. When I opened the microwave, there was a takeout container inside. I hadn't put it there. It was still cold, like it had just been placed in. I opened the lid. It was some kind of noodles, half-eaten, with a plastic fork stuck in it. The container didn't smell bad. It smelled fresh, like it had been put there that night. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. I messaged the host and said I was finding strange things. I mentioned the toothbrush, the clothes, and now the food in the microwave. They replied a couple of hours later and said it must have been left by the cleaners and apologized. They offered to send someone to tidy up again, but I said no. I didn't want anyone else in the house. I didn't like the idea of it. That afternoon I drove around, tried to get my mind off it, but the feeling stayed with me. Couldn't relax. I kept thinking about how the guy at the grocery store 2 days ago had bought food and someone had eaten it. How someone had been there before me, and maybe still was. That evening, I left the lights on inside the unit, packed a few things in my backpack, and went out to my car. I parked it just up the street, facing the guest house, and waited. It was dark by then, around 9 p.m., and the neighborhood was quiet. A few porch lights were on. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. I sat there in the driver's seat with the window cracked, pretending to scroll through my phone but watching the front door. Around midnight, I saw movement. A figure came from the side yard and walked straight to the front door of the guest house. He was wearing a hoodie and jeans, carrying a plastic bag in one hand. He didn't knock. He didn't look around. He pulled a key from his pocket, unlocked the door, and went inside like it was the most normal thing in the world. I sat there frozen. He stayed inside for almost an hour. I could see the faint light flicker through the blinds. He turned on the kitchen light. I saw shadows move inside. At one point, I saw him walk past the front window, casually, like he knew the place. Then, just like that, he left, locked the door behind him, and walked back the way he came, disappeared into the dark. I didn't move for a long time after he was gone. I didn't sleep that night, just sat in the car, engine off, doors locked. I waited until the sun started coming up. The birds started chirping, and the streetlights turned off. Then I drove back, grabbed my bag from the front steps. I hadn't gone back inside, and got the hell out of there. I didn't say anything to the host. I didn't message Airbnb. I didn't want to deal with back and forth messages or, "We're sorry for the inconvenience." I just left. I checked into a cheap motel down the highway and stayed there the rest of my trip. Sometimes I think about that man, who he was. If he was the long-term tenant the listing mentioned, maybe he never left. Maybe he and the host had some kind of arrangement. I don't know, but he had a key. He knew his way around. He felt comfortable enough to eat there, sleep there, leave his stuff. I wasn't supposed to be there. I think I was intruding. I think that whole place was just a front. Some kind of weird side rental where they figured no one would notice if someone else was still using it now and then. Maybe they did this often. Maybe people usually don't notice. I noticed, and I won't ever stay in a place like that again. I booked the Airbnb a few weeks in advance. The listing showed this charming loft with big windows, natural sunlight pouring in, modern furniture, clean white walls, even a few plants near the corners. It looked peaceful and bright, just what I needed for a quiet weekend away. The host had good reviews, and the place was close enough to the city center but far enough to avoid the noise. I didn't think twice about it. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was how rundown the building looked from the outside. The paint was peeling, and the hallway smelled like dust and something slightly rotten, like wet wood that had been left out too long. I figured maybe the outside just needed work. But as soon as I opened the door to the unit, I knew something was wrong. The place looked nothing like the pictures. The furniture was gone. Not just rearranged, gone. No couch, no dining table, not even the bookshelf that had been pictured near the window. The walls were cracked in several places. There were dark stains near the corners and patches where the paint had flaked off. The windows were smudged and the blinds half broken. Dust covered everything. A thick, settled kind of dust that takes weeks, even months, to build up. My shoes left clean marks in it when I walked across the room. But what threw me off most was that someone had clearly been there. There was a ceramic mug in the sink with dried coffee at the bottom. A gray jacket hung over the back of one of the remaining chairs near the window, and the bed was unmade. Not just slightly wrinkled, but the kind of messy where you know someone slept in it the night before. The sheets were bunched at the bottom, and there was a faint indentation on the pillow. It felt like whoever had stayed there had just stepped out. I stood there for a minute, unsure what to do. I checked the listing again. The pictures were still there, bright, staged, spotless. I even reread the description. It said, recently renovated, minimalist decor, perfect for solo travelers. Nothing mentioned any of this. I texted the host immediately. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe there was a mistake. They replied after a few minutes, said they hadn't been inside the unit for months, that no one had rented it since early spring. Said they were shocked to hear about the condition and offered to send a cleaner the next day. But that didn't explain the mug, the jacket, or the bed. I even asked if maybe someone had broken in. They said no. The locks were changed recently. They insisted it was secure. It was already getting dark outside, and I didn't feel like finding a hotel last minute. Against my better judgment, I stayed. I didn't touch anything. I didn't even unpack. I sat on my suitcase near the window for a while, watching the street below. The loft was on the top floor, 3 stories up. The building was narrow, just a handful of units. From the outside, it looked like a converted warehouse. I kept checking the door to make sure it was locked. I even wedged one of the remaining chairs under the doorknob, just in case. I left the bathroom light on and stayed fully dressed. I lay on top of the sheets, not wanting to touch them more than I had to. Every little sound in the building made me sit up. Pipes, floor creaks, wind. It was hard to tell what was normal in a place like that. At around 1 a.m., I started hearing footsteps. At first, I thought it was coming from the hallway, but the sound was too steady, too close. It wasn't the sharp echo of shoes on tile. It was dull thuds, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. It was directly above me, but there was no floor above. I knew that for a fact. I'd looked at the building from the outside. 3 floors. I was on the 3rd. The ceiling was slanted with exposed beams, and there was no attic access, no hatch, nothing. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, back and forth. I held my breath and stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was old pipes or an animal or something shifting in the building. But the steps didn't sound random. They sounded like a person walking. Then they stopped. I sat there, frozen, ears straining for any sound. Nothing. Just silence. I didn't move. I must have stayed like that for almost an hour, afraid to even shift my weight on the mattress. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been in my head. I was tired. The place was weird. I was probably just hearing things. I drifted off sometime after 3 a.m. When I woke up, the chair I'd wedged under the doorknob was pushed aside. The door was still locked. Nothing was stolen, but the chair was no longer in place. It had been moved gently, tilted to the side like someone had tried to open the door and stopped when they realized it was blocked. Or maybe they didn't want to make noise. I checked my phone. No new messages from the host. I checked the windows. Still locked. I went into the hallway and looked up and down the staircase. Nothing. I decided to leave. I packed everything up in 5 minutes and walked out. On the way down, I passed an older man at the mailboxes on the ground floor. I didn't say anything, but he looked at me and said, "You were in the top unit, huh?" I nodded, and he just gave this strange smile. Not friendly, just knowing. I didn't wait around to ask him anything. Later that day, I messaged the host again and told them what happened. The chair, the sounds, everything. They didn't reply. A few hours later, the listing disappeared. Gone from my reservation history. Just a generic note from Airbnb saying the host was no longer available. I reported everything to Airbnb support. They opened a case, said they'd investigate, but I never heard anything back after the first email. I tried searching for the listing again using different keywords, but it was like it never existed. No trace of it. I even searched the address directly on Google Maps. Street View showed the building, but the unit numbers weren't marked. I still think about that night. The jacket, the bed, the footsteps, the chair. Someone was living there. Not officially. Not listed. Maybe squatting. Maybe something worse. Maybe the host knew and rented it out anyway, hoping people wouldn't notice or complain. I didn't sleep well for weeks after. I kept checking locks. Kept waking up thinking I heard footsteps above me. I still do sometimes. I'll never use Airbnb again.